and feared in their own time. They were ancient warriors who invented the boot camp, the frontal assault, state-sponsored education, and a lifestyle and aesthetic that, to this day, bears their name. They are the Spartans, and this is their story. "480 BC, a narrow mountain pass at Thermopylae, roughly 85 miles northwest of Athens, Greece. It was the time and the place that would forever crystallize the essence of Sparta, in a single event that future generations will turn to again and again as a turning point in history."
What transpired at Thermopylae has been burned in the memory of Western civilization.
Thermopylae was actually a myth enacted in real life. Shakespeare himself could not have concocted more of a classic story.
A phalanx of 7,000 Greek warriors advanced on an invading Persian army of several 100,000. The Greeks were horribly outnumbered, but they pressed on, confident that the 300 men in the front lines could lead them to victory, simply because they were 300 men from Sparta.
A Spartan soldier taken by himself is as good as any other soldier. But you put them together and you've got an army that is better than any army in the world.
Just the sight of the Spartan army's signature lambda emblazoned on a wall of shields was often enough to secure victory.
There was nothing else like it in the world. It was the premier warrior culture of all time in civilized society.
The pitifully outnumbered Greeks miraculously held off the Persian onslaught through 2 days of gruesome combat. Finally, the Spartan king, Leonidas, realized that defeat was inevitable. He ordered thousands of remaining Greek soldiers to run for their lives. But all 300 Spartans stood their ground and fought to the last man, because they were Spartans.
The stand at Thermopylae galvanized Greek morale. It also bloodied the Persians and said to the Persians, "Don't mess with us."
The Spartans' stand at Thermopylae became a classic example of losing the battle, but winning the war.
Thermopylae has remained in history as a code word almost, for the concept of giving one's life, even in defiance of death.
These soldiers were willing to fight a losing battle in defense of their virtue and their country. They became the greatest fighting force the world has ever known. It took a unique society to produce such men who fought so methodically in the face of impending death.
The Spartans exemplify something that's a very important part of human nature: a drive for purity, a drive for order, a drive for harmony, a drive that gives us the courage not to fear death, and a drive that makes us fight for an ideal such as freedom at any cost.
While today we think of Athens as the birthplace of Western civilization and the high-water mark of Greek culture, it was Sparta that many Golden Age Greeks admired most.
They were really thought of as a kind of an ideal of Greek civilization. But it was a utopia in the sense that it was dedicated to an ideal of virtue, of service to the community, of selflessness and unity.
What the Greek city-state valued most of all was freedom from foreign intervention, a sense of belonging, and success on the battlefield. Sparta was abundant in all three.
During Sparta's reign, ancient Greece was a collection of more than 1,000 self-governing communities called city-states.
A city-state is really a city which functions for all practical purposes like a state or a nation, has its own government, its own army, its own navy, and its own laws. There were all of these states everywhere, many of them very remarkable for their culture.
Sparta dates back to the 12th century BC, a time of great change in the ancient world, when Egyptian power was waning and the Second Babylonian Empire was on the rise. According to Greek legend, Sparta began with violence and conquest, when in 1150 BC, invaders from the north, who believed themselves to be descendants of Hercules, moved south to reclaim what they believed to be their ancestral land. When King Lacedaemon took over the Central Peninsula, he named it Laconia after himself. He named the central capital Sparta after his queen. For nearly 400 years, until roughly 750 BC, Sparta was Laconia's religious, cultural, and governmental center. Art and music flourished.
Sparta is known for its beautiful choruses of singing women. The Spartans have a very attractive pottery that was traded. They were famous for bronze working.
These are very early examples of Laconian artistry. No fine art of Spartan origin has been found that dates after the 7th century BC. It's as if the people of Sparta just stopped making it.
The turning away from the kinds of visual arts that we see as prominent elsewhere is very clearly a self-conscious decision.
It was a decision that coincided with the greatest turning point in Sparta's history, a period known as the Messenian Wars. It began when a population explosion forced Sparta to seek new land and new sources of food.
They solved their problem by annexing an entire country which was both larger in population and territory than Sparta was. So that quirk of fate, that will change the course of Spartan history for the next 300 years.
The land they chose to take over was Messenia, a separate Dorian community directly to the west.
There's really nothing to make Sparta look absolutely strange and distinctive until the conquest of Messenia and its aftermath.
Messenia had rich farmland and a thriving agricultural economy. Today, it is where the famous Kalamata olives are grown. Messenia was also surrounded by rich stores of iron, Greece's most precious commodity for military equipment. Sparta needed Messenia, but the Messenians did not go quietly.
This was a long and hard war. The Spartans were not able to put down Messenian resistance easily or quickly.
The initial difficulty is simply topographical, getting over Mount Taygetos, which at its peak is 8,000 feet. But of course you don't go over the peak, you go round the side, and that means a detour, and that means marching a very long way. So you're very far from your base.
The people of Messenia were on their way to creating their own city-state culture. They resisted, they tried to remain independent, but the Spartans defeated them.
It would take nearly 100 years for Sparta to fully overtake the Messenians. But by the 7th century BC, Sparta ultimately controlled 8,000 square kilometers and became the largest city-state in the Greek Empire. The Messenians were forced to work the land as agricultural serfs called helots.
Helotage is a kind of tenant farming. A helot has a farm to which he must dedicate a certain part of every year's produce to a Spartan master. A particular Spartan master is in charge of each helot's farm, and yet the master doesn't actually own that helot as an out-and-out slave. He can't buy him and sell him.
No other city-state tried to enslave an entire Greek people. There's probably 250,000 residents of Messenia, and Spartan society is coalesced around 10,000 Spartan warriors. So they're vastly outnumbered.
We ought to think of Sparta as a state under siege. In some sense, there's an analogy here to modern Israel. Now, of course, there are many, many differences, but the Spartans and the Israelis have this in common, that they cannot afford the luxury of giving up their security needs.
The situation called for the Spartans to remake their society from top to bottom. They developed new rules that would control every aspect of its citizens' lives.
They are the only Greek population that devotes itself entirely to the arts of war.
According to the Greek historian Plutarch, the architect of this new warrior city-state was a Spartan lawmaker named Lycurgus. Lycurgus reportedly traveled throughout the Mediterranean, gathering the best of military statecraft from Crete, from Ionia, and from Egypt. He also received divine guidance from the oracles at Delphi, where it was said advice from Apollo was transmitted directly to him. With these new discipline guidelines, Sparta eventually transformed itself into a great militaristic society.
The armies, or the defenders in those days, were really just militias. They were just farmers taking down spears from above the fireplace and getting out there and fighting. Lycurgus, the original founding Spartan, so to speak, I think he just kind of said, hey, let's turn pro here. And then the whole society sort of unspooled from that decision, for good or ill.
His laws prevailed because they came with the authority of the Delphic oracle. And the oracle said that these laws should be obeyed as though they were divine laws.
Lycurgus may have been a man or the instrument of a legend. But in either event, the Spartans believed that it was Apollo's God-given wisdom that led them to create a master plan for Sparta. Their society was based on a pyramid of power. At the top were the roughly 10,000 men of the Spartan elite. They were called in Greek the homoioi, meaning the equals. In theory, each would have the same wealth and the same say in the government.
The goal was to make a society of equals, an army that could fight and where there would be no dissension, a polity that had unity.
Everything aims at homogeneity, similarity, if you will, and that is one of the keys to the Spartan system. We're going to have stability, we're going to have order, we're going to have obedience.
Below the homoioi were the roughly 50 to 60,000 free people who lived throughout Laconia, mostly on the outskirts of the capital city of Sparta. They were called the perioikoi, the dwellers around.
They allowed them to be independent, except that they couldn't make any political decisions. And they also compelled them to follow the Spartans whithersoever they may lead.
The perioikoi were essentially a non-voting middle class that kept the homoioi prepared for war.
The great bulk of the trade and the manufacturing, the craftsmanship that was necessary to maintain Spartan society, somebody had to make them weapons after all, was done by these perioikoi.
They were the engine that made it all work, because they freed the Spartan peers so that they had full leisure time to train athletically and every other way for war.
All pursuits not essential to the new Spartan machine were abandoned.
I think it's clear that one of the prices the Spartans paid for this solution to their problem was a cultural deprivation that they imposed on themselves. Because artistic creativity requires a degree of freedom that I think would have made them nervous.
At the bottom, and outnumbering everyone else, were the helots. The wives and daughters of the Spartan elite ran their households. This system left the equals responsible only to the polis, their Greek city-state.
They were willing to go to what turned out to be extreme measures to shape a state the like of which no one had ever seen before, and I suppose nobody has really seen since.
In the decades to come, Sparta would devise a new system of government that would control every citizen from cradle to grave. In the 7th century BC, Sparta was unique among all the several hundred city-states that surrounded the Aegean.
In every Greek polis, the state played more of a role in governing people's lives than many of us would accept today. Sparta went several degrees better. In no other city-state was the government as intrusive. This was a cradle-to-grave deal.
In fact, it was in the cradle that the first measure of the future Spartan equal was taken. At birth, government overseers examined each newborn infant of the elite to determine if he or she should be allowed to live. Less than superior infants were exposed, the Spartan euphemism for leaving an imperfect child to die in a mountain chasm.
This seems extraordinarily brutal, but the aim is to produce warriors. And so that's what they're looking for in these newborn children.
They needed good men, so I think that they would be unapologetic about the fact that they were breeding the best and strongest that they could.
Girl babies, too, had to be approved by the Board of Overseers, who decided whether they should live or be chucked off the edge of a mountain.
The surviving girls were raised to be mothers. The boys were raised to become Spartan equals, warriors who controlled the government. In Sparta, the government was by the people and for the people, if you were one of the homoioi, the equals. Everyone else, the periokoi and the helots, were non-citizens.
The Spartans were uniquely successful in devising a unique system, let's say peculiar to them, that lasted for very many years, in fact so long that Machiavelli and others took it as a model.
At the top of the Spartan government was a hereditary monarchy with a strange twist.
The crucial starting point, which seems to be the most ancient part of their constitution, is they didn't have one king, they had two kings.
Now, this is really weird. Most Greek cities had a memory of a time when they had a king. And many Greek cities maintained a kind of religious official who sometimes kept the name the king. The Spartans, however, had two kings, and they had real authority in society. Certainly real authority to lead the armies, profound religious authority.
The reason for this is they serve as checks and balances on each other. They prevent any one man from becoming too powerful.
The dual monarchy and 28 Spartiates over the age of 60 created a council of elders known as the Gerousia. The Gerousia set policy and served as the supreme criminal court.
Sparta was in some way a gerontocratic society. Old people ruled, and there were certain positions open only to old people. And one reason for that was if you survive to be old in a Spartan environment, you must be pretty damn tough.
Below the Gerousia was the Assembly of Citizens, which was made up of all Spartan equals over the age of 30, and was the least powerful branch of the Spartan government.
The Spartan assembly is not about deliberation. It is about, as it were, taking orders from people who have already decided the proper way for the society to go forward. The assembly is going to say, rah, rah, let's do it, when somebody proposes a policy.
Floating above it all was a board of 5 men called ephors, who ran the military, oversaw the educational system, and had considerable veto power over everyone, potentially even the kings. Their power was kept in check, however, by limiting their terms to 1 year and making them accountable to the assembly for their actions.
Those who serve as ephors or in other offices, at the end of their year in office, automatically go on trial. It's as if every president of the United States were impeached and put on trial at the end of his 4 years or 8 years in office and had to answer charges.
The goal of the Constitution was really to avoid allowing anyone or even any single institutional place in the society to become all-powerful. And I think that seems to have worked pretty well.
How could you get anything done with all of these people standing in your way? Well, the whole system was invented not to get anything done. Its purpose was not to change, to stop change. It did a terrific job of that.
In fact, for close to 400 years, Sparta had the most stable government in the history of ancient Greece. Yet it was anything but a democracy.
freedom of the citizen is a core element of democracy, the freedom to speak out, the freedom to vote your conscience, and freedom of speech was not characteristic of Spartan society. The Spartans had no conviction that freedom was even a good idea. Freedom was simply not in the package of virtues that a Spartan was taught to respect.
Job one for the Spartan government was to keep control of the Helots.
They knew the Helots hated them, and as one Athenian who knew the Spartans very well once reported that the Helots would gladly eat the Spartans raw.
So every year, the first item of business on the Spartan government's agenda was to declare war on the Helots.
And that was just sort of a formal way of saying any Spartan peer can kill any Helot anytime he wants.
Thucydides tells a chilling story about how the Spartans gave out the word that any Helot who thought he had done the best service for Sparta in the war